My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service. I want to welcome you all here today to this 1899 train station. This building served as a major passenger train hub for Arkansas and Oklahoma until 1967, at which point, when the railroad industry tumbled, depots all over the country tumbled. This one was saved and converted into our school. This is one of two campuses we have. We also have a restored 1887 building down the street in the River Market area. This building has just been renovated energy-wise, and we are applying for LEED status and are now in the monitoring period. Hopefully, when certified, it will be one of the oldest college buildings in the country, LEED for operations and maintenance. So we're trying to make the work of historic preservation in the environment compatible so that people can do that with other old buildings. Rather than tearing them down, they can restore them and use them in different ways. I'd like to welcome the Fruoff family here, who have been generous supporters of this symposium. Sue, David, and Anna Kay, would you all please stand? They are very good friends of ours at the Clinton School. Your presentation, students, were terrific yesterday. I got to see many of them. I don't want to, at the risk of playing favorites, and I don't want to do that, but I love the two of you that did the presentation about the Navajo mission in Arizona. I thought that was a fantastic, and it's a place that I have now put on my 100 places to see before you die list. I want to go see it. The Clinton School is the nation's first master's in public service. And when you think of that, when people ask about that, and all of you have been involved in public service, if you think of schools of public affairs and public policy and public administration, all important, all valuable, all needed, all very good, we are a cousin. We go to the family reunion, but we're not sitting at the main table. We are a very specialty type program where a significant portion of our academic curriculum is exactly what you all presented yesterday. We do 3 major service projects at the team, international, and individual levels. And throughout the 2-year curriculum, students are always engaged in field service. And so it is a different model. Because of that model, our students are never here all at the same time. And right now, 35 of them are on 6 continents, all inhabited continents, all over the world, slowly but surely beginning to return home for the next semester. So they're never here. So we unlike traditional colleges and the beautiful campuses of, my son is a graduate of Middlebury. I've been to several of your college campuses. You know, we don't need nor have the infrastructure needs of a traditional college program, because this is a very non-traditional model. So therefore, we don't have a cafeteria. We use the restaurants in the Clinton Library and Heifer International, which I encourage you to visit during your free time today. We don't have a library. We use the public library, which is 3 blocks down the street, where our volumes are held. We don't have a student union. We use the River Market, which is a gathering place a couple of blocks from here. And so we are able to invest in service and scholarship and not spend dollars on infrastructure and on physical plant and on maintenance. And so with that model, we are able to provide opportunities for students who have a commitment to public service through field work. Because as you all saw yesterday, it's not easy. And some of you had very serious challenges, and some of you saw the different workings between agencies and organizations, and you met it. Some of you, your presentation about the drug laws in Kentucky was superb. And so you see the challenges that people face, and we do about 100 projects a year with our students. So It is a different model, and I encourage you to look at it. We have several members of our faculty and staff who are here, and I'm excited later on this afternoon, while you guys are touring Heifer and the Clinton Library, that the faculty and the field service directors will have an opportunity to exchange ideas and best practices. So we welcome you to the Clinton School. As you leave the building today, as you walk out the back door, I encourage you to look at the map of where our students are. Also, one of the things that we ask each of our incoming students during orientation is for she or he to select a book that they think everyone should read. It doesn't have to be his or her favorite book. It can be everything from children's books to mysteries. But it is a book that you think you would recommend. And you can see the books that have been selected by this year's class, and we will be doing that for our new class in a couple of weeks. I really want to applaud Harlan Beckley and Fran and Wendy, Dr. Shepherd, and others for the fantastic vision for putting this program together. And we're, again, a cousin because we're a graduate school, but we're very, very proud to be part of it, to be associated with it. And what started at WNL that is now spread all over the country from sea to shining sea is a wonderful model and a wonderful example of how collectively we can do something about poverty. So thank you for being here, for making the long trip to the cool South. Although people from Baylor, it's not bothering them at all. But we welcome you, and it is now my pleasure to reintroduce the person that really got this thing started, and that is Harlan Beckley. Harlan.
I also want to offer some thank yous. I want to begin with a little story. My friend Hank Dobin and my wife and I were here early, and we walked down here on Monday to find Skip, and this part of the place was locked up. So we went down to the riverfront market, and by golly, there he was. He said, "This is our student union." So we had a cup of coffee together at the market, and just as he told you today. You'll hear more from him as the day goes on about the Clinton School of Public Service, and we want you all, both faculty and students, to know about what the Clinton School of Public Service does, and we are happy to be here and very appreciative of their sponsorship and their hosting this 2 days with us, along with ULAR, and again, I want to thank the Fruhaus, who have made, they have been contributors to the Shepherd Alliance, I think, for 15 years. It's been a long time, and made possible many, many internships, and we're very appreciative for their contributions to this program. I'm going to begin today by reading a letter. So I'll just read it, all right? Greetings to those gathered at the Clinton School of Public Service for the inaugural Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty Symposium. In our interdependent world, if you examine every region where poverty levels are being reduced, education is being improved, and the economy is more vibrant, you'll find networks of cooperation. I'm delighted to see the Shepherd Consortium with 14 member schools and promising prospects for growth forming these key partnerships to advance the public good. We have other schools here with us, Hendricks and Millsaps and Center College are with us too, and they are considering membership in the Shepherd Consortium. And I applaud Washington Lee for its leadership in the interdisciplinary study of poverty and human capability. Each of you wouldn't be here today if you didn't strive for a future of shared benefits, shared responsibilities, and a genuine sense of community. Fortunately, in the 21st century, the potential for positive change is all around us. In Brazil, during the presidency of Da Silva's time in office, The government reduced poverty by paying the poorest families to send their children to school. Laura, you experienced this summer some of the results of that kind of thing being applied in the United States. And in 2010, a UN report noted that in the poorest countries in the world, every 10% increase in cell phone accessibility added almost 1% a year to GDP growth. With new technologies and opportunities constantly evolving, this is an exciting time to be alive. I'm thrilled that so many higher education institutions are taking a leading role in recognizing and empowering impoverished communities, and I commend each of the students and faculty members in attendance for your collective pursuit of transformative power. Best wishes to all for a productive conference, Bill Clinton. So he couldn't be here with us, but he has sent us a message. It's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Sheldon Danziger has been one of the leading researchers on poverty for many, many years. He is, and I won't bore you with all the formal things, you can read about that, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know about Sheldon Danziger. He is the Henry J. Meyer Distinguished University Professor of Public Policy and Director of the National Poverty Center and Director of the Ford Foundation Program on Poverty and Public Policy at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. While he was there, many of my students have read Sheldon Danziger's work and also his edited volumes, and I want to say something about that in a minute. But they've also read his co-director, Rebecca Blank, who is now Acting Secretary of Commerce. And they are good friends, and I actually got to know about Sheldon Danziger because of Rebecca Blank. He belongs to the National Academy of Sciences. He's a Guggenheim Fellow. We could go on. But let me say something else about his work. One of the things Sheldon Danziger has been able to do is edit volumes that address a wide range of public policy issues for the community of people who are interested in learning more about poverty in the United States. And he has devoted his time and efforts to that, and those volumes have been very valuable to a lot of students in a lot of different contexts for a long time. That reflects his interest in not just being a researcher, not just being somebody who advances a narrow field in poverty studies, but helps to expose us to a broad range of issues that have to do with poverty, particularly in the United States. That makes Sheldon Danziger a superb keynote speaker for our inaugural conference, because he's going to be able to help us to understand better the kinds of things that we need to know about and that we need to understand if we're going to address the various issues that you guys encountered as a part of your experience this summer. So it was a pretty easy choice to invite Sheldon Danziger to be our keynote speaker today, and I'm going to step down and stand out of the way and give him time to talk to you, and then we'll have some time for response as well. Sheldon, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Harlan. It's a pleasure to be here. In fact, I thought I would start with a personal anecdote which will maybe set the tone for the theme of my talk. I arrived as a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin on August 9th, 1974. Why do I remember the date? It's because it was the date President Nixon left the White House, so I always remember the date. But what's important about the talk today is that every year in September, the Census Bureau releases the official poverty report. So I got there in August of '74, and in September the poverty report was released for 1973 because it obviously takes the census time to gather and get the data ready for public release. And the poverty rate in 1973 was 11.1% according to the official measure. And so I was then starting my career as a young poverty researcher, working with people like Robert Lampman, who had been advisors to the Council of Economic Advisors when under President Kennedy and then under President Johnson. And if you had asked me what poverty would be in 2012, I would have said, well, I just read Robert Lampman's new book, and Lampman says that poverty as officially measured will be eliminated by 1980, and then we can have a new measure. And shortly thereafter, James Tobin, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote a piece in the New Republic called "It Can Be Done," and he said we could eliminate poverty by 1976, which was the bicentennial. Well, fast forward, this September, the poverty rate will come out. It's going to go up because while the recovery is now 3 years old, it's a very slow recovery. So poverty will probably be about 15.5% this fall. And one campaign is likely to say, see, this shows that government policies are failed. And the other campaign is likely to say things would be a lot worse if we hadn't put our policies in place. So that's really the context of my talk today. And as I thought about this, I thought, well, what would be the simple, if I had a better title? And since I'm at the Clinton School, the students may not remember, but certainly those of us who are a little older than the students would remember the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." Right? That was President Clinton's key soundbite when he ran for office in 1992. So that's going to be really the bottom line of my story, is that the experience of the official poverty rate going from 11 to 15%, and there'll be these headlines, highest rate since 1969 or whatever year. I haven't gone back and looked. Therefore, all of this government is a failure. I want to say it's the economy stupid. So that's a little bit by the way of background. So because Harlan and I had some correspondence, and he didn't want me to just be an economist and present a bunch of numbers to back up what I was saying, I thought I would start by talking about some historical perspectives on what at least policymakers had to say about why people are poor and what government can do to reduce poverty. I'll talk about some historical trends, how we really did go from a period when a rising tide lifted all boats. Not surprisingly, that period ended in 1973. I wouldn't have known that when I first started as a postdoc, and I don't think it was clear until maybe 10 or 15 years later. I wrote a book with Peter Gottschalk in 1992 called America Unequal, trying to make this point. One of the titles that was rejected for that book was Pulling Apart, and many of you may know that Charles Murray this year wrote a book called Coming Apart, in which he basically says we live in a gilded age of rising inequalities. Now, he and I have different perspectives on how we got here and what we ought to do to reduce poverty and inequality, but I think by now there's no doubt we are living in a gilded age of rising inequality. I want to talk about some lessons from the Great Recession and the 2009 stimulus, and then I want to talk a little bit about how to reduce poverty and promote opportunity in the next decade. And I'm going to stop in time so that I'll be able to take plenty of your comments and questions. So I go back to President Johnson. Robert Caro has a huge book, the third volume. You have to go to about page 540, and you'll find 5 or 6 pages about President Johnson's declaration of war on poverty. In the current political context in which we live, I think it's even more remarkable. The 50th anniversary of this declaration is coming up relatively soon. What I want to call your attention to, and I've got the slide put on 2 so that you can read it without squinting, or at least so people my age can read it without squinting, is how similar the situation is today as almost 50 years ago. Americans today enjoy the highest standard of living in the history of mankind, but for nearly a fifth of our federal citizens, this is a hollow achievement. And then I underlined this. We cannot and need not wait for the gradual growth of our economy to lift this forgotten fifth of our nation above the poverty line. We know what must be done, and this nation of abundance can surely afford to do it. And the last, today as in the past, higher employment and speedier economic growth are the cornerstones of a concerted attack on poverty. But general prosperity and growth leave untouched many of the roots of human poverty. Essentially, the arguments being made today in the presidential campaign are how to get the economy moving. What's the way? Nowadays, we're not just talking about maybe the bottom 20%, but maybe the bottom 40%, as the middle class has struggled over this period as well. And one side says we ought to get the government out of the economy, we ought to cut taxes, and a rising tide will lift all boats. President Johnson said, and I say this is the theme of my talk, general prosperity and growth leave untouched many of the roots of human poverty. Certainly, economic growth is important. When was the golden age within this gilded age of rising inequality? When was the one period when the real earnings of workers increased since 1973? It was in the period from about 1994 to 2000, when the economy grew rapidly, the real wages of workers increased, and poverty, as officially measured, fell almost back to the 1973 level at the end of the Clinton administration. And that was because we had a period in which there was both a rising tide, but there was also an attention to public policies. So the early war on poverty thinkers under whom I trained, and Jennifer Warlick and David Betson are here from Notre Dame, and they were part of the same group who was trained by Robert Lampman and Bob Haveman, Gene Smolensky, and others at Wisconsin. Very much the view that economic growth is necessary but not sufficient. Nobody is saying economic growth is not important. There was the view, however, particularly you'll see in a minute, by those who advocated government intervention, that the poor were victims of circumstance beyond their control. So if you read the 1964 Economic Report of the President, Chapter 2, which would be a good first reading for any undergraduate poverty course, it sets out what Johnson's advisors thought. Among the various things mentioned were discrimination. Right at the beginning, that particularly African Americans went to schools that were unequal. They entered the labor market, therefore, with less skills because they didn't have equal opportunity, and they faced discrimination in the labor market. So there was very much a view that people are poor because they don't have access to quality education and equal opportunity, not that, as I'll show later, the view the poor just don't want to work hard enough. Very much a view that lack of income is the problem. It was very much a view that we should build up the human capital of young people. After all, Head Start, Job Corps, aid to higher education, anybody in this room who has had a Pell Grant or a Stafford loan, all of that you'll find the origins in Chapter 2 of the 1964 Economic Report of the President. But very much a realization that if Head Start and equal opportunity work, those kids won't enter the labor market ready to earn non-poverty wages for 15 to 20 years. And so in the short run, lack of income is the problem, and people may have heard of something called the negative income tax, which was essentially proposed by the President's Commission on Income Maintenance. And this is very much a view that probably seems strange to the students, not having heard an official report say something like this for a long time. We have concluded that more often than not, the reason for poverty is not some personal failing, but the accident of being born to the wrong parents, or the lack of opportunity to become non-poor, or some other circumstance over which individuals have no control. Our main recommendation is for the creation of a universal income supplement program financed by the federal government, called a guaranteed annual income, a negative income tax. The first president to actually put that forward was Richard Nixon with the Family Assistance Plan in 1969, pushed by, at the time, Special Assistant to the President Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who later went on to be Senator Moynihan. So this was a period in which I would call it a golden age of social program growth. It totally reshaped the safety net. It's what Paul Ryan hates about government programs today. If you think back to 1964, there was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid, there was no supplemental security income program. Food stamps was a very tiny pilot program. There was no earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit evolves out of Nixon's negative income tax. Essentially, it's a negative income tax for workers. The big difference being that in a negative income tax, if you don't work, you get something. And in the earned income tax credit, if you don't work, you get nothing. But this was an age also of optimism about government's ability to solve complex social problems. There were experts writing memos that actually led to programs being put in place, not likely to happen these days. There were willingness to spend federal funds to reduce poverty and promote equal opportunity, and willingness to take federal action in the face of state and local government opposition. And again, the war on poverty and the civil rights revolution really come together. There are, I think, appreciated stories. Recently, some researchers have noted that when Medicare came in, you could not get Medicare payments if you were a segregated hospital. So the introduction of Medicare had a lot to do with the desegregation of hospitals. And the researchers have shown that because this happened over a period as various hospitals changed their policies, you could see infant mortality among African Americans go down as they got access to hospitals they'd previously been excluded. Similarly, the aid to K-12, Title I, which still exists today, came out of that period, and it was the same kind of thing. If you had segregated schools, you couldn't get federal money. Now, of course, all of this seeded the opposition to federal action, and you can see today in the Supreme Court, the part of the health care law that was struck down says the federal government can't tell states that if you don't expand Medicaid, we're going to withdraw your Medicaid money. But that's exactly what was being done at the time. Federal pressure was being used not only to in the case of Medicare, provide universal access to health care for the elderly, but also to desegregate hospitals. So this was the period in which I started my career, rapid economic growth with modest recession since the end of World War II, rapid wage growth for all workers. I'll show you a slide. It's really remarkable, but those at the bottom actually did a little better than those at the top. This was a period when there was a spread of employer-provided health insurance and pensions. More and more workers got them over this period. Congress kept increasing the minimum wage periodically, and so it rose relative to inflation. At the end of this period, in today's dollar, the minimum wage was something like $9.50. It's $7.50 today, $7.25. A period of rapidly falling poverty and slowly falling income inequality. And so sort of this was the context in which people like Lampman and Tobin said, well, the official poverty measure will be obsolete by 1980. But all good things must come to an end. And in 1973, there was an oil embargo, disrupted a lot of production. Just look at what's happened to the automobile market since then as an example, and we live in an increasingly global world, one with increasing technological changes. And so poverty went above 15%, both in the early 80s and the early 90s, and in 2010. So the official poverty rate is about 15.1 or 15.2, roughly in 82, 83, 92, 93, and 2010. As I said, in 11, it's likely to go above that, and that's likely to get a lot of headlines in September. Poverty fell during recoveries, but never back to the 73 level, very close in 2000. And the big change is, and that's what I'll talk about when I say it's the economy stupid, less educated workers no longer benefit from economic growth, except for this short period in the 1990s. So here's this chart. When people say a rising tide lifts all boats, all of these bars are big. Roughly, the bottom 20 percentile and everybody else, incomes roughly doubled, inflation-adjusted family income, between 47 and, that's got 75, because I'm borrowing data from somebody else. I would have picked 73. But the point is, all these bars are high. They're similar, but the top actually is a little less than the bottom. That's what we mean by a rising tide lifts all boats. Everybody gained. The gains are high. And there's no real increase in inequality. There was a small decline. This lovely step ladder is easier to see. This is what we mean by rising inequality. The bottom 20 percentile, 3.7%. The top 5%, 56.7%. So we went from rapid growth, equally shared, to much slower growth. Everybody does worse compared to this period, and they're roughly periods of 25, 35 years. That's what we mean by from a rising tide. This is the chart that most people, I think, find surprising. I certainly would have given you a different answer if asked in the early 70s. This shows median earnings for full-time year-round workers from 1960 to 2009, adjusted for inflation. What had happened, and I don't have the previous data, if we had 47, it would be down here somewhere, but basically, this is what people thought. The economy will continue growing, and will add on these anti-poverty programs to help bring up the incomes of those at the bottom. No one who was a serious analyst would have predicted that in September 1974, when they announced these census data, the results would be virtually the same 35 years later. It's the economy, stupid. This has nothing to do with unwillingness to work. These are full-time, year-round workers. This has nothing to do with people getting unemployment insurance and not working. You don't get unemployment insurance if you work full-time, full year. This is what happened. And this is about the median, the middle male earner. This includes all of your professors in the room. If I show you this for high school graduates, it's much worse. But this is all full-time, full-year workers, regardless of education. The good news over this period is the line has continued to grow for women. And to the extent that there is a change in what's been driving family income, in the post-war year, it was the earnings increases that men were getting, because most families had one earner. Since the early 1970s, women have been the engine of family economic growth for the middle-class families that don't get government benefits, because more and more women have been working, they've been working longer, they've been getting more education, and contributing more to family income. It's why does the middle class feel stressed? Because if they think back, if family incomes haven't grown much, and your real income today is similar to what it was 20 or 25 years ago, but now you have, maybe then you had a husband and a part-time working wife, now you've got a husband and a full-time working wife, you don't feel like you're better off because you're putting in a lot more work to get that level. Again, here's the story. It's certainly why we tell students that it's a good idea to get a college degree. Real median weekly earnings 79 to 2010 by educational attainment. Again, all of these are rising inequalities. Family income I showed you earlier. This is earnings of individuals. Those with less than a high school degree and those with a high school degree, no college, and even those with some college or no associates, no real wage growth at all. Again, these are full-time wage and salary workers. So this isn't about people who've dropped out of the labor force. People who've dropped out of the labor force are a serious problem. But this is for full-time, full-year workers, and for the technical aficionados in the audience, this is deflated by the personal consumer PCE. David will remember. What am I forgetting the exact? Not the CPI. So this is less inflation prone. In fact, I think I stole this chart from a Rebecca Blank presentation. So it's the official acting secretary of the Commerce's data. We can't question that. So here's the poverty rate, which shows this story. Later on, we can talk about the supplemental poverty measure. David Betson, who's here, is an expert on that. But basically, the story I'm telling, around 11% in 73, back again around 11% in 2000, but these peaks of 15.2, see at my age, 15.1, which is where we are in 2010, and it will go higher in 2011. So that's the poverty rate of the story. Why are we in this era of rising inequality? Skill-biased technological changes, globalization of markets, the decline in unionization, the erosion of the minimum wage, declining progressivity of federal income tax, and the explosion of executive pay and the size of the federal sector, of the financial sector. All of these are inequality increasing. Now, the story I tell my students is not all of this is done by big bad corporations, which they like to think. So I tell them why I'm a job killer. And I suspect you're a job killer too. In Ann Arbor, we had this wonderful local bookstore near campus. And it turns out they made, it was like Christmas for them twice a year, the first week of classes in the fall and the winter. And they made something like 90% of their profits. They sold textbooks at face value. So what would happen is, my first class is the day after Labor Day, you come to class, hand you a reading list, and it says the following 3 books are required. They're at Shaman Drub Bookstore. By the Thursday class, I want you to have read chapter 1 of this, chapter 2 of that, etc. So the students would all rush to the bookstore. There'd be lines out the door. You know, they'd go around giving people bottles of water. And the students paid list price. And then the rest of the year, it was one of these wonderful bookstores with English ABDs. You'd go in and say, you know, my sister-in-law likes books like this. What should I get her for her birthday? And you'd spend time, and they'd have wine and cheese receptions when faculty published books. Even though hardly anybody bought them, people would come. And so a few years ago, the university said, we need to get into the modern age. We now have students enroll in April. By June 1st, you should send them the required readings on email, because everything's online. You just go to, it's called C-Tools at Michigan, and you send an email to your class list, and you say, here are the 3 books. And then over the summer, they can buy them on the web, anywhere they want, discounted prices, come to class. Students like it. It's cheaper. Shaman Drum doesn't exist anymore. You can go through that with travel agents, with bank tellers. So a lot of this is labor-saving technological change. Economists think that's a lot. I'm not an expert on the auto industry. People who are, though, and I don't have the exact numbers, will say this plant is now making 1,000 cars per day. It takes X workers. It used to take 3X workers to produce the same car. So there's just been an awful lot of what economists call skill-biased technological change, which means that some workers have global markets and other workers have restricted opportunities because there are not many more local bookstores, small local travel agents, et cetera. This is the Congressional Budget Office data on rising inequality. This just to show you the top 1%. This is a little different measure of income. This is probably better than the data I've shown you, but the bottom 20%, 15.7%. Over here, the top 1%, 280%. But again, these are the 5 quintiles, and then these are progressively as you move up the ladder. I'll skip that. The typical CEO versus the typical worker. Again, you can see from, numbers that seem relatively quaint, 25 and 35 times the typical workers, to numbers in the hundreds. Same thing in terms of wealth. The wealth of the wealthiest 1%. So the story I want to tell is, if there's all this action going on where full-time, full-year male earners are not earning more, and if there's all this evidence about rapidly rising wages at the top, why is it that when most people are posed the question today, and this, I'll suggest this goes back to 1980, why are people poor? They don't say it's the economy, stupid. They say the poor lack personal responsibility. The poor don't take advantage of available opportunity. Government programs exacerbate the problem. People will argue that poverty does not decline when benefits increase due to work and family disincentives. Go back to Charles Murray's famous Losing Ground, Harold and Phyllis, and he said, because of government benefits, Harold doesn't marry Phyllis and support her on low wages. He moves out so that she can get welfare. And a view that it's not money. So poverty isn't about money. Well, this is a different view than President Johnson. President Reagan's view was, in 1964, the famous war on poverty was declared, and a funny thing happened. Poverty as measured by dependency stopped shrinking and actually began to grow worse. I guess you could say poverty won the war. Poverty won in part because instead of helping the poor, government's programs ruptured the bond holding poor families together. And so today you see this in calls that say President Obama is the food stamp president. We need to cut back food stamps because it's sapping people's willingness to work. Now my view says, gee, unemployment went up. We were losing 700,000 jobs a month. The unemployment rate doubled very quickly. It's come down slowly, but there's still 8% of the population officially unemployed. Lots of others are working part-time who want to work full-time. Seems perfectly reasonable that that would be something you would be proud of, that when the economy knocked people back, we tried to stimulate the economy, but for those who are still left behind, we have food stamps. That's not the view. Money alone will not cure poverty. Internalized values are also needed. The most disturbing element among a fraction of the contemporary poor is an inability to seize opportunity, even when it is available and while others around them are seizing it. For policy wonks, you can go to the New York Times blogs. There's a professor at Chicago, Casey Mulligan, who has been writing that the unemployment rate is this high because of unemployment insurance. A similar story. If we would just get rid of unemployment insurance, all these unemployed who are laying around collecting UI would be able to find jobs. They would seize opportunity if we didn't give them that safety net. Lawrence Mead, poverty reflects social disorder more than deficient opportunity. This is very different than the view that said you have the unfortunate problem of being born to a poor family instead of a rich family. Now it's not deficient opportunity, it's social disorder. The chief solution is to restore order. Government must provide pressure to work. Work must become an obligation and not a choice. So a very different view of the safety net. In some ways, in this view, the best safety net is no safety net, except perhaps for the aged, blind, and disabled. I want to speed up. Why are poverty and inequality higher in the U.S. and Europe? I know we don't want to be like the French, but we aren't even like the Canadians. I live in Detroit. I live in the Detroit area, Ann Arbor. I can be in Canada in less than an hour if I can get across customs. But, you know, the Canadians don't seem all that different to us, but they have a very different set of policies, certainly with regard to the safety net and health insurance. Americans are more likely to believe that anybody who works hard can get ahead. Americans are less likely to endorse government's responsibility to reduce income differences, and Americans prefer a flexible labor market with relatively little government regulation of firms. So in some sense, the weak safety net which we have is one which is very consistent with the views of most Americans, and the Johnson view and the 1969 Income Maintenance Commission view that I've advocated are the ones that are different. And so I just thought I'd show you this and then show how the two different views play out. So these are the data. Likelihood of young adults enrolling and graduating from college by parental income. This has gotten worse over the last 30 years. My colleague at Michigan, Sue Donarski, has a paper about this. For real policy wonks, there's a Russell Sage volume of about 600 pages called Wither Opportunity, edited by Greg Duncan and Richard Murnane. So let's just go to graduated. 11% of children whose parents are in the bottom of the income distribution graduate, 53% at the top. Why? Well, these two views, Americans do believe, everybody believes, that all who are qualified should have an opportunity to attend college. That you get almost universal. But then, should government intervene? The yes view, the view I've been pushing, educational opportunities are limited by circumstances of birth. If you grow up with two parents who are college graduates, who are affluent, they talk about college all the time, you see a lot of college graduates, they take you on college tours, they suggest that you study hard, they buy tutoring for you, and if you turn out to be stubborn and dumb as a post, they can still find a private college that will take you if you pay 100% tuition. I mean, there are open admission private colleges, and and if you flunk out of that one, they can pay for the next one. Now, that's an extreme case. But if you're poor and you don't know anybody who's gone to college, and you're bright, one, you might not understand that Pell Grants are out there. Two, I don't know how many people have looked at what's called the FAFSA form, F-A-F-S-A. Okay, so my colleague Sue Donarski has argued that should be on a postcard, not 140 questions. The first time I saw it was when my son was going to law school and asked me to help him figure it out. He was an independent student by then. And I had a hard time. So one of the things, their demonstrations, they've done this, they've done experiments. If you offer to fill out the FAFSA form for low-income kids, they're more likely to go to college. Okay, so that says something about opportunity and information, because then people are told. The other thing Sue Donarski says about the FAFSA form is they ought to tell you in December how much money you could get when you have to apply, not after you've been accepted, because you may not apply because you didn't realize. In any case, that's one view. I suspect most of us who are educators in this room and students who have been supported by these programs have a view that there's a role for government. But the other view is opportunities available, but poor children don't study enough and poor parents don't supervise enough. So I've debated Lawrence Mead, and he said, I live in New York City, and all the valedictorians in New York City are kids who came as immigrants, and their parents don't even speak English, and they graduate at the top of their class and go to college. It's just not enough willingness to take advantage of available opportunities. So that gets us to the Great Recession. If things weren't bad enough in 2007, the Great Recession was long and deep. As I say, we've just celebrated the 3rd anniversary of the economic recovery. The good news is we're not in a recession again like Europe. It's hard to get excited about the counterfactual, so my story here is things would be a lot worse without the stimulus. The stimulus was too small, but in any case, this was quite a perfect storm in which we had not only a labor market crisis, but a financial crisis and a housing market crisis. This just shows index job loss. In the 1980s, early 1980s, we lost about 3% of the jobs. That was the most severe recession we've had. Unemployment went up to 10%, poverty went up to 15%. So I said, well, look, we lost 6% of jobs in this recession. Unemployment went up to 10%, poverty went up to 15%. Damn, that's good, right? Twice as much job loss and the same. Now, that's a hard argument to run on. It's the counterfactual. I would have thought that if we lost twice as many jobs, poverty would have gone up even more. On the other hand, following both the recession of '81, we quickly got back within 24 months, and then in the recession right after Bill Clinton came into office, in less than 3 years, we got back to 100%. That is, we had recovered all the jobs within 2 to 2.5 years. So where are we now? This is from the Hamilton Project at Brookings. And the good news is the economy's been growing. Oops. The good news is the economy's been growing. Jobs are being added. The bad news is how long will it take to get us back to this 100%? So I'm going to just read the quote. If the economy adds about 200,000 jobs per month, which was the average monthly rate for the best year in the 2000s, then it will take until November 2023, November 2023, to close the jobs gap. So don't believe anybody who says this is miraculously going to change. Given a more optimistic rate of 300,000 jobs per month, which was the average monthly rate for the best year of job creation in the 90s, that is when President Clinton was in office, here's the optimistic perspective. The economy will reach pre-recession employment levels by 2017, another 5 years. So this is not a recession that anybody could have quickly gotten us out of. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that. So the Stimulus Act, most people who hear about it, particularly if you listen to Fox TV, which I don't, this would be the failed stimulus. And Governor Romney just said we don't need any more stimulus from the Federal Reserve, even though just yesterday the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, who I don't think is a member of the Occupy movement, said that we needed more stimulus from the Federal Reserve. These are not radicals at the Federal Reserve who think we need more stimulus. So Krugman was saying this early on in Stiglitz, the stimulus was successful but too small in hindsight. It kept the recession from being more severe and poverty from being even higher. That's the argument I made. It was poorly explained by the administration, misreported by the media, and it's become a political failure that's led what I call deficit mania. That all of a sudden people are crazy about, we got to do something about the deficit. Nobody said the deficit is a problem when we were fighting Afghanistan and Iran and not paying for it. You know, a lot of people don't like Lyndon Johnson because of the Vietnam War, but there was a 10% income surtax to pay for the Vietnam War. We didn't get a 10% income surtax during the Bush years. We piled up a lot of debt. And the Bush tax cuts, while they have done some very good things for low and middle income families, also piled up a lot of debt. So why all of a sudden is deficit mania the order of the day when we're in this very severe recession? And I'll get to it in a second, but if you sort of think about it, and again, it's very hard to get this in the monthly news. If you look at the jobs figures, so we had disappointing jobs figures for a few months and so-so last month, 160,000 jobs added. If you actually go and look back over the last year or so, you will actually find that the private sector has added roughly 3 million jobs. And state and local governments have eliminated 1 million jobs. So if you want to know about, gee, we ought to get our house in order, that's really good, state and local governments have to balance the budget. And they were bailed out during the stimulus because the federal government paid for teachers and fire protection and police, et cetera, with federal money. And then Congress said no more stimulus, even though the president proposed it. So what happens? I'm sure it's true here, but at least where I live, 6 city policemen, 25 school teachers, 3 firefighters, et cetera, et cetera. So state and local governments have been cutting budgets. That's what deficit mania gets you. Yes, it gets the state fiscal house in order, and no, it doesn't promote the recovery. In Michigan, we have a flat state income tax, I think, which was 4.2%. I don't think it's very high. And basically, the Republicans who control the state said, no, we can't go to 4.3%. So we have to cut state aid to state and local schools by X percent, to universities by Y percent. Now, at the University of Michigan, it doesn't affect us because we're a national market. We just raise tuition. That's not a very happy response for students, but as I said, there are a lot of high-income people who are willing to pay high tuition. So the University of Michigan is relatively unaffected when the state cuts spending, but many state governments, the state controls both tuition and the budget, and I know many deans in the California system who have spent the last year cutting and cutting and cutting, so that now I'm told, yes, they've managed to balance their budgets at a lower level, but if you need these 6 courses to get a degree in computer science, and they're only giving 1 section instead of 2 because of the budget cuts, then it takes you that much longer to get the required courses and graduate. So again, I just want to make the point that, yes, deficit mania does work in cutting the budget, but when you do balance the budgets, the state and local governments are a good example of what happens. Now, I guess you could say if we got rid of food stamps, well, it would hurt some grocery stores, but it wouldn't lay off that many people. I mean, we could cut 20 million people off food stamps. They'd be a little hungrier, somebody would give them a handout. So what did the stimulus do that I like so much? It was a massive expansion of unemployment insurance and food stamps, which is exactly what I thought one should do during a recession. There was a new TANF, is the welfare program, emergency jobs program. I don't know, yesterday I saw in the newspaper today, Governor Romney was criticizing the president for welfare reform. The stimulus bill had a $5 billion program, which lots of states with Republican and Democratic governors loved. It provided 80 cents if the state put up 20% and allowed the states to subsidize jobs at private or public or nonprofits. So the state could go to a firm that was floundering and would say, we'll pay this worker's wage for the first 6 months if you promise to keep them another 6 months. This was exactly the kind of thing I think makes work pay for people who can't find jobs. There was a new work pay tax credit. Again, when people are asked, did your taxes go up? Virtually everybody got a tax cut from the stimulus. There was an expanded earned income tax credit and an expanded per child tax credit. In terms of human capital investments, expanded Head Start and early Head Start, more money for the Child Development Block Grant, American Opportunity Tax Credit, and a Pell Grant expansion. So in 2009, after this passed, I was really optimistic. And I gave a talk called It's the Best of Times and It's the Worst of Times. I said it's the worst of times because unemployment is about 10% and we're in this terrible recession. But, we'll get out of it. I didn't quite realize how bad it was. And the stimulus has all these anti-poverty policies and pro-human capital policies that middle of the road, I mean, this is not left-wing stuff, middle of the road policy analysts, whether at Brookings or AEI, have been talking about for a long time. And the president says he wants to make all these things permanent. And obviously now, all of us know people who lost jobs through no fault of their own. I had, 20 and 30-something nieces and nephews and cousins laid off for reasons that had no fault of their own, and they got unemployment insurance, and they got their health insurance covered by the stimulus because that was, again, part of the stimulus. And I had a cousin who had dropped out of college who went back on a Pell Grant. So people will say, these are not loafers, these are people who were working full time, and there's the stimulus. And, well, obviously that didn't happen because we all think it's the failed stimulus, and all of these things have either expired or about to expire. I need to speed up so I can get to questions. I just want to call your attention to the top. It's important for those who are teaching. Daedalus is a journal put out by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The fall 2010 issue was on the Great Recession. Bob Solow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, put together the articles. Robert Hall is quite a conservative economist. He's the intellectual author of The Flat Tax. He has a wonderful piece there. He basically says, this is very restrained, the combination of increased federal purchases and benefits raised output and income. Stimulus worked in the sense that the recession would have been substantially worse without the stimulus. He actually, if you read it, he doesn't quite say it this way, goes on to say that the stimulus needed to be larger because state and local governments were cutting so much that the net effect was too small. So I recommend that piece. Alan Blinder is a more liberal economist. He was on President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisor and the Federal Reserve Board, and there's a funny story about him tutoring Chelsea in algebra. So we're in this slow recovery. In my view, the ARA, the Stimulus Act, kept the recession from being deeper and lasting longer. Safety net spending on low-income families increased dramatically, which in my view was just what we needed. That's just the poverty carried back. That's the unemployment. So where are we? We're not in my it's the best of times, it's the worst of times 2009. I think it's just the worst of times. Unemployment is high. I read you the quotes about how it could take up to 8 years to replace all the lost jobs. Real wage growth for less educated workers is unlikely. Nobody's going to, almost nobody, some states have, going to raise the minimum wage during this period. Employers certainly don't have to raise wages as they do in a labor shortage. In fact, many people, some of you who are recent college, or you're about to be college graduates. So some of your older brothers and sisters may have found they graduated from college recently and they're taking jobs that they thought might be filled by people who don't have college degrees. But obviously, if college graduates and high school graduates are applying for the same job and you have 200 job applicants, it's easy for firms to choose the better educated workers. I've mentioned the rest. Income and wealth inequalities are at their highest level since the 1920s. States are cutting social programs and public sector jobs, and deficit mania threatens the safety net as we know it. I'm going to argue that it's the economy stupid. Structural labor market changes keep poverty and unemployment high, so the poor, so even if the poor have a responsibility to work, they need support. That is, many of the people who are maligned as freeloading food stamp recipients are people who are working full-time, full year at the minimum wage. And I would say the good news is they're getting a rather substantial earned income tax credit. They're getting food stamps. Their children are probably on CHIP, and when the Health Care Act goes into effect, they'll have subsidized health insurance. So that's the poor have the responsibility to work, but I also think government can effectively reduce poverty, and modest tax increases won't destroy the market economy. President Obama has proposed that the tax on the very top income earners go back to where it was during the Clinton years, and as I've suggested, those were certainly not troubled economic times compared to what we've had. What would I do? I would make permanent the ARRA's food stamp and unemployment insurance changes. I would establish a subsidized jobs program for the long-term unemployed based on that TANF emergency jobs. That is, I agree with Larry Mead in the sense that we're going to have a safety net in which people are expected to work. We're not going to go back to that 1969 commission that wanted a guaranteed annual income. But I do believe there are many people who want to work, are willing to work, but can't find a job. And the way to test that is the following. You say, okay, you get nothing unless you're willing to take this job and see what happens. And in many places, when these subsidized jobs programs were available under the stimulus, they were oversubscribed. More people wanted in. I would expand the earned income tax credit for childless low-wage workers, and this is heresy everywhere. I would let all the Bush tax cuts expire. If you're worried about the deficit, then you get back all the money. Now, of course, I'm not in Congress, and God, no, you couldn't run on this platform. In fact, I got eliminated from testifying before the Senate Finance Committee because they asked me what I would talk about, and I showed this slide. I said, nope, we'll get somebody else. What's funny is they got somebody who was far to the left of me but said nothing about tax cuts. So I would let all the tax cuts expire. That would put then a lot of pressure on Congress to make serious changes in the income tax. The last time we really had serious changes was under President Reagan. We need to do that, and this would be a good prod. Yes, it would fall off the fiscal cliff. I guess you could phase them out gradually, but that's where, in my view, it's better to let the Bush tax cuts expire than to cut food stamps and unemployment insurance and the earned income tax credit. For children, expand early education programs. I haven't talked much about kids. Expand supply of teachers in disadvantaged school districts, expand magnet and charter school options. These are all things that are discussed in one of the recent edited volumes. Harley mentioned Changing Poverty, Changing Policies, make college more affordable. Again, part of the Paul Ryan plan is to say, well, Pell Grants have just grown out of control. We need to take them back to the 2007 level. Well, the 2007 level was clearly too low, and they actually ought to grow more because, you know, they're so rich, the maximum Pell Grants are about $5,500. Now, that doesn't get you very far. I'm going to skip that. This I should do. So again, 5 years is a long time. When candidate Obama was running, and I won't be cynical, far be it, but I would point out that John Edwards was also running then, and he had an anti-poverty campaign. But certainly candidate Obama had a quote which also made me optimistic in 2009, which sounds Johnson-esque in that regard. In this country, no child's destiny should be determined before he takes his first step. Our government cannot guarantee success and happiness in life, but what we can do as a nation is to ensure that every American who wants to work is prepared to work, able to find a job, and able to stay out of poverty. What we can do is retire the phrase working poor in our time. So I would argue that the Stimulus Act, if those components had been kept in place, would go a long way toward achieving that. Finally, responses to safety net credits. I got the whole time to myself and didn't have to debate Charles Murray or Paul Ryan or Larry Mead. It's the economy, stupid. Labor market changes, not the failure to take available jobs, are the primary reason poverty and unemployment remain high. Safety net programs reduce poverty without large distortions in work and family choices. Yes, there are some people who get unemployment insurance and don't look for work, but that's not most of them. And modest tax increases can reduce poverty and inequality without disrupting the market economy, because you can't pay for the kind of programs that were in the stimulus unless you get the revenue somewhere. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Sheldon will monitor his own questions, but as you ask them, stand up and ask them fairly loudly. And may I ask back there, he ought to repeat the question into the mic. Is that right? Yeah. Oh, you got mics? Oh, we've got mics. There, so if you'll let
Okay.
yeah. I'll let Sheldon monitor the question. Yeah, please do. Oh, we got a mic over here. So get
Hi. Is it on? Okay. Thank you for your talk. It was really wonderful. I just heard a report last week that during the recession, of course, we know that private industry eliminated a lot of jobs. But during this so-called recovery, they have not replaced those jobs. But productivity hasn't gone down. It's remained the same, which suggests that private industry has learned to do more or the same amount of work, same amount of productivity with fewer people, which doesn't bode well for, I guess, reducing unemployment. Outside of partisanship, and you suggest this in your recommendations, outside of extreme partisanship, are there any plausible economic reasons why the federal government cannot intervene in this matter and create jobs in the way it did during FDR's presidency? I hope that's clear.
Okay, sure. The first part is what I was referring to as labor-saving technological change. So this morning before I left the hotel, I printed my boarding pass. So when I get to the airport, Delta now has fewer counter people because they know that half of us print our boarding passes. We love it. I don't want to stand in line. So it's great for me. So that's part of the labor-saving technological change. It continues living in Michigan, I think the view is the Obama administration saved the auto industry. Employment is increasing, but again, the point people are making is, and again, I don't have the numbers, it's not my area. There is a refinery in Detroit, and I forget who owns it, but they put something like $5 billion into upgrading the technology. And they did that. Why are they staying in Detroit? It's very hard to build nobody wants a new refinery in their backyard. But what's remarkable is this huge capital investment, increasing computerization. It will run with fewer workers when it's online. So that's part of this labor-saving technological changes. Now, when I think of the need of public service jobs of last resort for people who are willing to work but can't find jobs, what I have in mind are things like states were doing. They are service-type jobs that are not capital intensive. What am I thinking of? Lots of schools in inner cities can't afford playground monitors, so they close the playground after school for liability reasons and say, you can't play, lock the gates, you can't play basketball, go on the slides, etc. You could have half-time public service jobs of last resort at the minimum wage, at which young people, people who want to work part-time, could work from 3 to 6. That gets you 15 hours a week. That's not displacing anybody. It's not a good job. I live in the Detroit area. The city has cut back on lots of services. You could think about extra teachers' aides, extra cafeteria monitors. The school districts have been cutting out all these positions. In the old days, people used to think public employment will replace jobs, the word was displacement, that governments would do anyway. But we've gone a long enough period. My brother is a school teacher in Los Angeles, a high school teacher. There's a tax increase measure on the ballot in November, which people are not sure it will pass. The tax, I think the tax would go, sales tax would go from 9 to 9.25. Most states have 180 days in the school year. California has been on 9% furlough for the last couple of years. So he teaches 170. If this doesn't pass, California is going to go to 150 days a year in its public schools. So, I mean, I can assure you there are no playground monitors at his school. So in my view, there are lots in a time of high unemployment. And who are the people who have a hard time getting jobs even when there's low unemployment? Are high school dropouts, African American men, particularly if you have a criminal record. Now, you're not going to put somebody with a criminal record as a playground monitor, but you might put them to work in a cleanup crew. So I think we just haven't thought about this. The last time we did something like this was the late 1970s with the program CETA, Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. That was one of the first programs that President Reagan got rid of. So, you want to pass the mic to whoever? I'll let you choose the lucky person who gets the mic.
I'm Kevin Blair from Niagara University. I don't know if this is going to work out to a real question, maybe an observation on which you can give an opinion, but at breakfast there were a number of us talking about the dominance of market-oriented economics and market-oriented economic theorists at business schools, economic schools. Where's the counter by economists to that type of market approach to even ending poverty? And why isn't it stronger? Why are more economists out there pushing harder back against that kind of market approach? Because it leaves us in the social sciences arguing with economists.
Well, it's a good question. I would refer you to a recent issue of the American Prospect, because this year is the 50th anniversary of Michael Harrington's The Other America. And I believe it's the article by Harold Meyerson, who also writes in the Washington Post, who made the argument that while Harrington's book played a key role in getting the attention to poverty, it was the economists who were market-oriented, like my mentor, Robert Lampman, and others, who ran the program. And so I think this is in quotes because it's not right, but there is no economics of the left in the economics profession. From the very beginning, the economists who launched this war on poverty and favored a negative income tax were both Milton Friedman, whose original idea as a conservative, and James Tobin as a liberal. And everything I've said about the earned income tax credit and food stamps and health insurance is very different from saying we want to make sure employers pay a living wage so workers can support their families. It's accepting the market, accepting the labor-saving technological change, accepting the globalization, but saying the government needs to be there to make sure that when the market generates losers, they're compensated. So, and this article basically says, while Harrington got them to launch the war on poverty, he lost the battle because what he had in mind was strengthening unions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it would fit very much with the tone of your comment.
I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. So we all just spent an entire summer engaged in this war against poverty, and I was wondering if you had any practical advice for us as we continue to engage in it, maybe after college.
Well, I think what you're doing is terrific, and it says that you haven't bought onto the new conventional wisdom that the poor just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I think in the absence of more federal support for public service, obviously things like Teach for America, Vista, AmeriCorps, lots of nonprofits. I mean, basically, think of what the Gates Foundation is. I wish the Gates Foundation would do as would do more in the U.S. than they're doing, but certainly what they're doing overseas. It's very interesting to see that there are lots of exciting experiments going on in many developing countries, in part because I think they're not caught in this partisan bickering that prevents us from doing anything. And I think Harlan mentioned it. So New York City had a conditional cash transfer program. Did somebody work in New York City? Okay, so Harlem Children's Zone. Mayor Bloomberg was able to do this. It does help. He's the Tony Soprano of mayors in the sense that he said, we're going to do this privately, so I didn't have to go through the city council. New York City copied a program that began in Mexico. I think it was called Oportunidades there. President Clinton, in his letter, mentioned that it was in Brazil. So this is the first time I know that an anti-poverty policy started in developing countries and got imported to the U.S. But we had, so except for Mayor Bloomberg, who did it privately, in New York City, the experiment essentially gave low-income parents in a poor neighborhood cash incentives. If you take your kid to the dentist and bring a slip from the dentist, $25. If you go to the parent-teacher conference, $25. If your high school kid patches the Regents exam, $600. And they did this for a couple of years. The reason I said it was Tony Soprano is because Mayor Bloomberg put in something like, I'm putting $10 million of my own in. President of the Rockefeller Foundation, you'll put in 10, won't you? And they did. And so they raised all the money privately. And I know somebody at a foundation who basically, I said, oh, it's great, I see you're supporting this anti-poverty program. He said, yeah, like we had a choice. But it's for people who are interested, MDRC does these experiments. They've done great experiments on transitional jobs programs for ex-offenders, welfare recipients. So if you're looking for model programs that show these things can work, you can find them, and the New York City program is an example. President Obama had in, I believe, the Stimulus Act, money to try to expand the Harlem Children's Zone to 10 cities, but I don't think they got more than the planning money out of Congress out of that. So part of the goal was to do that. But as I understand, philanthropy, which plays a big role in experimentation in the U.S. because the government is less likely to do so, is important. So when Harlan told me that there are 33 courses on his campus about poverty, and there are all these schools in the consortium, I thought this is just terrific because you can go to many, many highly ranked universities, and I think you'd be hard to find one or two courses about poverty, and it was certainly the case. I think it's less true now, but people I know who teach at elite colleges were saying that they couldn't convince their students either to go to public policy schools or to get a PhD in economics because they all wanted to be investment bankers and make a lot of money. Now, this was about 10 years ago. So the fact that all of you are interested in public service, I would just say go back and tell your friends about the experience because what you're doing is really important. And to the extent that model programs like Harlem Children's Zone capture people's attention, they provide models for when, you know, if we were ever at a point where government could innovate, we would do that. I mean, I can remember enterprise zones. The Clinton administration came in and funded, I don't know, 10 or 20 enterprise zone experiments with federal money. And we're just not, I mean, nobody's talking about the poor, period, but nobody's talking about innovative programs in a lot of the areas that hopefully all of you saw this summer. Yeah.
It's interesting that one of the things you mentioned is one of our students who's now at the University of Notre Dame, by the way, wrote a paper on the conditional grants in New York to investigate those things. And he learned about them first because he's interested in Latin America, where they were first instituted. So one of the things you can do is go back, and you can check out this paper by Chad Kavit Dejunga on our website, actually. One of the things you can do is go back and work in courses and then write papers about things that grow out of your experience, and then go to University of Michigan Gerald R. Ford School, or Cleveland Clinic, or the Clinton School, or a number of other places where you can continue that work.
My name is Daphne Mugai, and I'm a student at Washington and Lee University. I did a couple of poverty courses last semester, and we got a speaker from Texas. He had done research on early Head Start and Head Start programs, and according to his research, he said, first of all, there was barely any statistics got from the early Head Start and Head Start programs. Those statistics that were received showed that the programs were not exactly as successful as they're being advertised right now. They also said when they looked at the statistics from the programs applied in larger cities, like I think they did one in New York, the statistics showed that there were not really any benefits. He said it was really expensive to do these programs, and all in all, he basically said these programs are highly advertised, but they do not seem to carry on the benefits they seem to bring when you just look at them. So looking at one of your recommendations as being expanding the early education program, what would you say about his research? And also my second question would be, why would you recommend EITC expansion just for the childless low-wage workers? What wouldn't it equally benefit the family, like low-wage workers with families, or would it be counter?
So the first one, the short answer is it's just not right. I'll come back and give the long answer. The second one is the EITC is already very large for families with children. So if you're a minimum wage worker and you have 3 kids, this year you'll get close to $6,000 from the EITC. If you live in one of the 20 states that have a state EITC, you might get $1,500 more. So there are workers earning the minimum wage, roughly $15,000 working full-time full year, who are getting $7,500. If you work full-time full year and you're a single person, you get nothing. So what I'm thinking of is a lot of men, many of whom are her absent fathers, who have a high school degree or less. They're being, in some states, put in jail for not paying child support. And so the earned income tax credit for singles and childless couples is a way to supplement low wages for a group that's been neglected. So the EITC started in the late 70s. It grew under Reagan, it grew under Bush the father, it grew under Clinton, it grew under Obama, big increase under Clinton. It's terrific. I would worry about calls to cut it back, but my expansion was for a group that's been left out. On Head Start, the long story is there's a very long paper. It's a little technical. The first author is named Jens Ludwig, Ludwig. You go to the website of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the argument is the following. It depends on what you're comparing, and it depends on how long you look out. So I don't know what the person from Texas said. I have a 3-year-old granddaughter. I can guarantee you that she has more cognitive capabilities than a poor kid in Head Start. That's the wrong comparison, right? Because she's an advantaged kid in a high-quality preschool. So the good experiments are comparing kids who go to Head Start to similar kids who didn't go to Head Start. So I don't know what but yes, Head Start kids will always be behind the mainstream because they start out. So again, it's part of, you can cut the gap by 20%, but there's still a gap. So that's the count. The other is, kids are in Head Start for a very short period and then go into the public school system, and many kids go into public schools that are not very good. So the long-run cognitive effects on Head Start are relatively small and in some cases won't be there. So you can say test scores don't go up. If that's what the person was talking about, fine. But again, go to the website of James Heckman at the University of Chicago, who's a Nobel Prize winner, and he's reanalyzed a lot of data. And what he shows is a lot of non-cognitive benefits to early childhood education. Less teen pregnancy, less delinquency, more high school graduation. So there's a serious body of research. I mean, Heckman is a Chicago economist, and he believes that we ought to have more early childhood programs. That doesn't necessarily mean that Head Start is the best model. It doesn't mean that some Head Start programs may be bad, but the notion that one of the ways to cut the deficit is to cut Head Start. So what I would say is we need to expand early childhood education. Somebody who was in the Harlem Children's, they have something called a baby college, which starts apparently at birth with the parents. So, maybe you look for other models, but I would just say there's a lot of solid research on early childhood education paying off for disadvantaged kids. Heckman would go so far as to say, take all of the money, get rid of Job Corps, get rid of he'd say by the time they're high school dropouts, it's too late. Focus everything on early childhood. But so I think, I don't know who was talking or what particular study, but I happen to have just read this long paper by Ludwig, and there's some, actually it may be Gibbs, Ludwig, and Miller, but you can find it at NBER.
Hi. Okay. I'm Nate Reisinger from Washington and Lee. I want to join everybody in thanking you for being with us today. It's an honor to meet somebody that played such a starring role in the paper that I wrote at 3 a.m.
Thank you for your honesty.
You don't know it, but you were right in that carol with me. By and large, I agreed with a lot of things you proposed. But I wanted to maybe see if I could challenge the second bullet point that's still up there. I think, again, by and large, that's true. But one of the things that I ran into a lot this summer working at a public defender firm was that a lot of the clients would come in and would be drawing an SSI check and would say that they couldn't work because they take the SSI check away. And I heard that from a couple of the other interns. So I guess, is that an instance where there's a disincentive to work associated with the safety net program, and how do we correct the disincentive without just cutting the safety net?
Okay, good question. Jennifer Warlick knows more about SSI than I do, but I'll try. So the whole disability determination process is very complicated, and it's relatively simple if you get in a closed head injury accident riding your motorcycle and you're paralyzed and partially cognitively impaired, then it's fairly simple. But for lots of diagnoses, particularly mental health diagnoses like depression, where people come in and out of it, and other physical ones, it's very difficult. So SSI, when it was started, it grew out of the programs for the aged, blind, and disabled, and it really thought if you get disability, you're not able to work. And so the program is not really set up for people who might be able to work sometime. And so let's say you're somebody who suffers from clinical depression and it's been hard to get on SSI, and there's not a way to say, okay, let me go work for 6 months. If I get laid off, I'll easily get back on. So I think there are some disincentives in the disability program. It's the same thing in Social Security disability. So it's what I was talking about here were mainly programs like food stamps and unemployment insurance. The disability programs opens up a whole number of things. Again, personal anecdote, my brother-in-law, he's now retired, was an administrative law judge, and he basically heard appeals, and he basically said it came down to his having to make a decision after reams of doctor and expert reports, will not work or cannot work. And he had to make a decision, and he'd say, you couldn't say, I'll give you half benefits and let you work half time. In other words, you had to go the either or. So the answer is, what I would both say is there are, particularly this came up in welfare reform, there were lots of women who had been on AFDC who were expected to work and then found themselves in what people call the disconnected, no work and no welfare. And when people looked at that, these were often people with many barriers to employment, but not enough to get you on disability. So there's some people, you know, if you have this, the Olympians are out here in the positive tail, and people who are totally paralyzed are in this one, inability to work, and then there's this distribution, and at some point the rules draw a line, and around that line there's going to be issues. And it's much the same thing in unemployment. So you can imagine somebody who had a job earning $20 an hour and who finds now they can get unemployment insurance for 99 weeks, and somebody says, you know, there's a job at McDonald's, and they say, you know, I'm hoping to get a job like I did, and maybe at the end of 99 weeks they will take the McDonald's jobs. Now, are they not taking available jobs? So what my point there, if you're interested in the technical literature on it, I would recommend a number of papers by Robert Moffat, who's in economics at Hopkins, who has spent many years trying to estimate the labor supply and family effects of safety net programs. You need to wave at the person with the mic, not me. There's some people up front afterwards.
Hey, my name is Yanisha Norris. I go to Spelman College. You didn't talk about it, and I just thought about it because she asked about early childhood. I just want to know what you thought about No Child Left Behind.
I'm sorry?
I just wanted to know what you thought about No Child Left Behind.
About early childhood?
No Child Left Behind.
Oh, No Child Left Behind. I know almost nothing about it. My colleague, Brian Jacob, you could go to the Ford School website and look at his papers, and the blurbs there come from a chapter by Jens Ludwig and Brian Jacob in the Changing Poverty, Changing Policies, and I think he believes it was a step in the right direction, but I don't want to claim to know enough to say more, but that's where those bullets came from.
My name is Alexa Rancourt. I go to Furman. I found what you said about the labor becoming more dependent upon technology. I found that very interesting. And I guess I was just thinking that from what I've seen and then what you were describing, it seems to me that if that continues and as technology increases, that will only decrease the number of jobs available in kind of this middle sector of work. So it seems to me that there might be this gap that's created where there's, you know, still the jobs on this side that are very kind of firm-specific jobs, and then kind of the low-wage general work, but a lot of diminished jobs in this middle area. And I guess I'm just wondering if you see that as a potential and how to maybe combat that, because if education and everything is not increased, it seems like a lot of those people would move down to the low-wage jobs.
Well, I think that's right. There is an argument. David Autor of MIT, AUTOR, is very much of the hollowing out middle. Harry Holzer, Holzer, who's at Georgetown, has argued it's not quite so bad. But again, if you think of, and that's why actually both the Clinton and the Obama administrations have emphasized community colleges. There are lots of jobs that now require some technical skills where there's a shortage of workers. So being in the automobile area, for example, welding, there's a shortage of welders. With a large number of baby boomers like me and Harlan and people, there's going to be a big demand in the healthcare arena. There are lots of jobs in hospitals for respiratory technicians, and so there are a lot of jobs where community college certificates can get you in. Those jobs can't be exported. Many of those are going to be probably low wage unless we do something about, I mean, why is the child care market a low wage job market in the U.S. and not a low wage market in Europe? I mean, again, that gets to the question about market economics. But elder care and child care in this country are low pay. There's going to be a big demand for home health care and nursing aides. People who get certain certifications can at least get good jobs. It's why I think we need to make sure we have food stamps and the EITC available, and why healthcare is so important. I don't know if people have read any more Jason DeParle's book about welfare reform. One of his respondents, and I can't remember which one, worked in a nursing home where she didn't have health insurance and then hurt her back lifting patients. Well, one of the good, again, I would have thought in 2009 that we as a country would be happy that we were going to cover the uninsured. We don't seem to be happy about that, but if at least that part of the law does go into effect, except in the states that refuse to expand it, then that won't happen. Low-wage workers will have health insurance. So I think those trends are there. The only, where are the growing sectors besides sort of more technical workers in hospitals, IT, and manufacturing, where in the old days you could probably do it with a high school degree or less. You now need a certificate. What's exploding in cities? Restaurants, coffee shops. There's more computer power in what I have in my pocket than what I did my dissertation on. So it's hard to imagine what things will be like 30 years from now. But certainly we've had 30 years or so of labor-saving technological changes. I mean, and you can already in Europe there are no toll takers because they have high minimum wages. I mean, one of the, there's a trade-off. Europe has high minimum wages and therefore less jobs. And if you think about a toll taker job, it's not a very good job. Most of them are unionized public workers, so they get insurance and pensions. And Easy Pass does away with it. In Europe, basically, you have to have a credit card. There are just no toll. And so one can think of a time when, I don't know how many toll takers there are left. I just drove somewhere on the Ohio Turnpike. There's still toll takers. That's a job that's likely to go away. And you can, labor-saving technology hasn't come to higher education yet, but one can imagine it. But I'll be retired before then.